Okay, I apologize for the delay. Actually, I did the same video a while ago, and Zoom ate it. So just be warned about 1 out of 8 or 1 out of 10 Zoom videos. If you try to record them, will not record properly. So here it is. Anyways, North America. What I want to look at here is the geography and the other regions we've looked at. Is how the geography has sort of shaped the potential and the possibilities, and how that's changed with sort of modern national identity. First off, when you look at North America, especially for folks from the United States, what they call themselves Americans, of course, there's actually 3 parts to this. There's the southern part, which is Mexico. There's the central part, which is the U.S. And there's the northern part, which is Canada. And of course, then there's Alaska up here. So notice how it's very much a unitary thing. You've got a single mountain range that goes all the way from here down to Oaxaca in the south, all the way through up into Canada, in fact, into its version up here in Canada and in Alaska. So you've got this really long, single physical feature, one of the longest in the world, actually, that just basically dominates this entire, sort of area. And there's 2 sort of side effects of this. One is because this is very high mountain ranges, because it's growing rapidly. It tends to do a very, very good job of capturing snow and shaping wind and rain patterns during the year. So what that means is, because of the snow capture, is that this captures large amounts of snow. And of course, when it gets warmer in the spring and summer, that melts off and drains. So because of the way this mountain range is set up, the vast amount of drainage is basically over here. Canada doesn't get quite so fortunate in that for a bunch of reasons. And Mexico, of course, the problem with poor Mexico is the mountain range is right smack dab in the middle, so there is a lot to drain too. So the huge sort of benefactor of this sort of physical features is what became the United States. The second is that when you look at this whole area, the idea of temperate zones is really, really centrally key. You get it down to Mexico, you get down to here, and what you're doing is you're moving into the tropics. So you've got the very, the sort of classic tropic scenario. You get up in here, sort of about this line right here, and you're moving up into the subtemperate or near Arctic conditions. So in many ways, Canada looks a little bit like Russia. A large part of the huge landmass that makes up Canada is trapped in the subtemperate zone, so it's not really very accessible, which is one reason why the population in Canada is so much lower. You just don't have, your only sort of functional living area spaces here. Also, if you notice in Canada, unlike the United States, is you don't have this western region of, usable good land. You pretty much have the mountains literally, especially in British Columbia, the mountains literally go right into the ocean. So Canada didn't get quite the same benefits from all this that the United States did. Of course, Alaska's got exactly the same scenario as Canada, but worse because it doesn't have any temperate zones. So when you're looking at this area, that's one of the really key features, is the absolute dominance of what we call the Rocky Mountains in terms of defining almost your entire climatic pattern. The second is this is a relatively recent mountain system. This is part of the huge fracture zone of the American continents as it crashed into the Pacific continents. So the end result is even though it's not that old of a piece of real estate, is you end up with enormous amounts of mineral wealth found throughout this entire region. Mexico down in here is famous for silver and copper. It's copper up here, you've got oil over here. You've got, gold, silver, copper, you name it in this area here. And even, of course, into Canada and Alaska, you've got the gold, the copper, the silver, I think pretty much gold and copper. So you've got enormous amounts of mineral wealth. But the most important feature is actually the fact that you've got this amazing riverine system. This is what the United States sort of lucked out at, because you have to remember when the Spanish settled, they're pretty much interested in the southern part, because that's your huge Indian populations. Your Native American populations were largely down here. So that's the area they focus on, and that's the area they take over. But you have to remember that initially that included here, Louisiana, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California were all part of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. And of course, the part of purchase, these were also. And then, of course, these areas get taken over by the United States after the 1847-48 war with Mexico. So these were actually part of the Mexican Republic till the mid-19th century. So in that situation, what you've got is that becomes the scenario here. Now, the key thing to remember is when the United States starts to, sort of get settled by, we'll say, 1850, because then this area is pretty much already defined. You have to remember, and it's sort of hard because people just don't think about it. We're so hung up on driving cars. They don't realize that unlike any place else in the world, maybe except the Amazon, but the Amazon's tropical, so you don't get the same advantages. You literally, in 1850, for example, you could get in a steamship here and go up the Mississippi River. You could go up the Missouri River, which I think is over here somewhere. And you basically go all the way over here, and you can end up in what's we know in Yellowstone National Park, right here, between Wyoming and Montana. 3,500, 4,000, I don't know how many miles. It's got to be 4,000 miles by the time you put the wiggles in. And you never have to touch dry land. You literally just go from one river to the other. All these rivers are big rivers. They're movable rivers in the sense that you can move freight on them. A tremendous advantage. It's sort of like what Europe has, but magnified in terms of scale by a factor of maybe 100. And this gave what becomes the United States an enormous advantage. Because these riverine systems allowed the United States to industrialize without needing the technology of rail and stuff like that, which happens later. You have to remember, I didn't have to go back and Google it, but the Erie Canal in New York, which I think was, I don't remember what it was, somewhere here, somewhere there. When the Erie Canal's dug, I think that's the 1830s or I don't know, somewhere early 19th century, and they do it with picks and shovels. But when they finished that sucker, that suddenly the amount of money available in New York just completely went through the ceiling because you now had water access. So the access, the ability to move through rivers, which is all this area here, not only defined the growth of the United States as a country, but in large part it actually defined a huge proportion of the cities in the United States. Our cities based along this enormous network of rivers. It goes all the way from, say, West Virginia, all the way down to Louisiana, as I mentioned, all the way over to basically this area here. So what you had is this network, this web of water, which allowed you with very little technology to build a flatboat. I think of your Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn. You're basically, that's what you're doing. You're floating, you're moving, you can very much, anyone that wants to, as long as they don't drown, can pretty much go a huge portion of the United States just by virtue of using the water. Now what that means is this area here, which is tremendously wealthy in terms of agriculture, it gives you this already built-in system where you could grow huge amounts of food here, throw it on a barge here, and then float it down to the big cities anywhere else in the United States that need it. Or if you want to, you float it all the way down to New Orleans, and then you ship it out to any place else in the world. So the United States pretty much has almost like a built-in transportation system once they start to access from the the eastern seaboard colonies, which the other areas don't. In the north, you don't have the same amount of rivers, but of course you've got the Great Lakes. Canada has those too, but if we zoom into here, notice when I get to north, we don't have the river systems. What you've got is a glaciated system with basically a lot of lakes, like you'd see inside Michigan or maybe Minnesota, maybe. So you've got lots of lakes, but that's not, if anything, this is like Russia. This is hellaciously difficult to get across if you think about it. And you can see it just sort of the lack of roads. I mean, look at how few roads you see in this area. Now, one of the other side effects that's really important to understand, especially with the rhetoric in the United States right now, borders, is the fact that what you have is these rivers also are your border system. A huge part of the border between the United States and Mexico is the Rio Grande River that I think we covered earlier this semester. So what you've got is that allows you to sort of define one country and the other. But of course, the Rio Grande moves around. It changes course, it changes direction. And so when these countries don't get along, they end up with a sort of a silly situation where you might be in one country one day. It's a perfect example right here. We'll say that, I don't know, one of you has a little ranch right here, or farm. Now we'll say it's spring, the river's rising, the river comes out and it floods out. And what it does is it does this all the time. It cuts through here. In fact, it has cut through here in the past. You can see an old river channel here. So it goes back to its old river channel here. Now, since that river marks the United States and Mexico, if your house is right here, yesterday morning you were in the United States. All of a sudden, when you wake up this morning, technically you're in Mexico because the river defines the split between these two. So if you're the contemporary American government, you decide you're going to build a fence around here, you could look pretty damn stupid because, of course, the minute this river changes direction, you've just lost, I don't know, whatever you paid to have that fence built, but it now belongs to Mexico. Now you have to build a new fence. Of course, the river might change, go back this way. No, in fact, the river's gone this way before. Here's an old part of the river up here. So this thing goes all over the place. You know, as long as the two countries get along, I mean, who cares? I have no idea who this island belongs to. You know, I guess technically it's Mexico right now, but you know, if you ever wanted to be sort of always have a little excitement in your life, you can just, you know, buy this sucker. I'll live on it, you know, every other day. You might be able to change countries and never move a foot. So what you get is you get this enormously complex boundary, again, driven by the river systems. So the rivers are hugely important for that. If you notice here, when you get on this area, then you end up in a border that has a fence, but it's pretty much nothing else there, because you've got no riverine borders. And traditionally, for months of American history, especially with Mexico, this has been an area of a fair amount of tension with mercenaries and you know, revolutionaries and all sorts of stuff going back and forth across this region. Go Google Pancho Villa if you want to see some of this back in the 1905, 1910, something like that. When you get up in the north, it's even more interesting because I think I mentioned when I sent that last set of videos on Canada out, the border between the United States and Canada is the longest non-patrolled border in the world. A lot of it has fences on it, but a lot of those fences are just cow fences, and a lot of it's never really patrolled. So you pretty much, a lot of this, you just walk across the border. Your only reason for hassle would be when you got across, if someone asked you for ID, you'd be in trouble. But if you notice, a lot of this border is actually right through the middle of the huge part of the lakes. And again, it gives you some idea of the complications of all this. There's apparently, I've never been there, but it's apparently a tourist attraction when you go to Niagara Falls. You can stand on a line, and one foot you're in the United States and the other foot you're in Canada, because this is Canada and that's the United States. Same thing with, where's Detroit? I lost Detroit here. Same thing with Detroit. You got Detroit here. You go across in the suburbs on this side, which is obviously part of the city, and bang, you're in another, you know, you're in Canada. So, you know, when you have tensions between these two countries, if ever it got bad, like I did say in the early 19th century, then it would cost an absolute huge amount of a national budget to go and actually fence this area to market. So one of the key things about North America is, one, there's only 3 countries in it. And 2 is, despite their differences, for example, in Mexico and the United States right now, what you find is in many ways they're sort of, if not umbilically, they're certainly sort of, you know, sympathetic to each other's needs, or have to be, because they don't have the luxury of anything else. So when you're looking at North America, you really do have to look at it as a package deal. Now, what happens when one country takes advantage of that vis-a-vis another, and this is the classic case would be here. So I mentioned rivers. And okay, so here's the Grand Canyon. This is the Colorado River. So the Colorado River starts way in the north up here. Comes down here, grows. Is one of the major rivers in the United States. Drains through all this area. Now, you know, right into the early 20th century, actually almost mid 20th century, the river just went all the way down through here, drains all the way through here. You can see going here, and drains down into the Baja, the sea. Now, what happens in the 20th century is the United States first, as the Western region, some of this in here in Arizona then, but largely in California, just showing lesser extent Nevada. You start to get the increase in population, and what they want is they want power. So what you do is you build these enormous dams, and you build these dams for power generation. Now, when you build these dams initially, you're doing this, and of course, once you're done, letting the rudder squeeze through, the water just keeps on going south. But very quickly, what happens, ironically, because you have more power available, is then what happens, you have more people. The more people you get, the more water they want. And so what happens is if you're in Phoenix, the water you drink comes from the Colorado River. If you're in LA, the water you drink comes from the Colorado River. Now, notice there's quite a distance here. But these are the huge aqueducts that you can see if you go east of LA. These enormous, man-made rivers that tap the Colorado to basically feed Southern California, which was a desert before. And the same is true with this. This whole area of Phoenix, Scottsdale, all that is basically uninhabitable for modern populations without that. So what happens is you start tapping that. Now you're not just using the water for energy. Now you're actually drinking it, which means now if you fill your pool in LA, if you wash your car in Las Vegas or Phoenix or something like that, that's Colorado River water you're using. Now what happens is when you start doing this again and again and again, you build more of these basically irrigation and water features for the purpose of tapping the water. As you start using it to an enormous extent here, and all of a sudden, ba-bang, where that river went into Mexico and flowed for millions of years. This is what the Colorado looks like in Mexico. The bugger is completely, totally dry. One of the world's larger rivers is as dry as a bone. Roughly 99% of the year, unless, in fact, in some years it never gets any water. Only if there's massive amounts of rain up in the north and in the US, does any water flood in there. Then it usually comes as a flood just screaming down through this area. So notice how you've got irrigation largely pumped in water from aquifers, but your river, which until 1930 provided all the farmland here, which was one of the richest farmlands in the Americas, is entirely dead. That's an empty, dry ditch. So people in LA and Las Vegas and Phoenix and all the rest of the Southwest have lawns. They have swimming pools. They have nice, clean cars. They have all the rest of the stuff they want. And Mexico gets totally screwed. I remember we talked about this early in the semester, is the idea that if you're upstream, this is actually a huge strategic impact because you can actually control what the countries below you. You have them at their mercy. You've got a blackmail on them. Sad thing about this is the United States never intended as blackmail. The United States just didn't give a crap. The United States wanted to use the water. The United States sort of figured, well, in fact, in the mainland United States, I'm like, here, water is actually seen as something you can buy. You can actually invest in water in the mainland. You can actually buy water rights. So what happened is the river just got used up. Now, of course, environmentally, this is an enormous nightmare because this whole area just becomes an absolute disaster because there's no river here anymore. In fact, what little water you see in this area is basically just raw sewage. And when you get down here, this whole area where the Colorado River flows into the Baja Sea, what you've got is basically this whole thing is, as you can see, almost entirely dry and salt. It's a salt flat. It's like being outside of Salt Lake City. But this was all wet. This was all wet, fresh water until the early, second 20s and the 30s in the United States. Look at that poor river. There's absolutely nothing there. One of the world's larger rivers is completely dry because the Americans just totally sucked it up. And so what happens is it's down here before it actually gets in here. So all this, some of the best farmland in the Americas in here, gone. And it's Americans always, Mexico this and Mexico that, but they don't really dawn on them. There's two sides to this, as with most stuff. Sorry about that short disruption. So when you look at this region, this is what's really, really key to understand is you can talk about national identity. You can talk about Americans versus Mexicans, Canadians versus Americans. the reality is the physical relationship of this entire region is one package unit. It's not, it doesn't split itself up into nice, tidy pieces. And, you know, it's always important to remember that, just if nothing else, not for just an environmental standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint. These countries are linked in a way that's almost inseparable. They're almost like Siamese, I don't know if there's Siamese trio, instead of Siamese twins. So when you're looking at this area, you're looking at a very complex network, physical, geographical, and to a certain extent, whether they want to or not politically. For all the rhetoric that, you know, Americans don't like Mexico or that has to be a temporary state of affairs, or else they're just going to both take each other down. So with that physical part.